In 1803, the United States doubled in size overnight. Thomas Jefferson bought 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon Bonaparte for $15 million, 3 cents an acre. The deal is taught in every American school as one of the great strokes of diplomatic fortune in history. The Louisiana Purchase, the moment America became a continental power. What is almost never taught is why Napoleon sold it. Napoleon had plans for a French empire in the Americas. He had no intention of selling Louisiana. Then something changed his calculations entirely. Not a diplomatic negotiation, not a financial crisis. A group of enslaved people in the Caribbean who fought the most powerful army in Europe and won. So how did a slave revolt on a small Caribbean island accidentally hand America half a continent? That is what this video is actually about. Not the Louisiana Purchase, not Napoleon. The country that made both of those things happen and was then handed an invoice for doing so. A real invoice, delivered at gunpoint, for 150 million francs, and paid every last centime of it for the next 122 years. That country is Haiti, and its story is one of the most consequential and most deliberately buried in the history of the modern world. Nobody was paying attention to Saint-Domingue back in 1750, or rather, everybody with money was paying very close attention, and everyone else had no idea what was happening there. That was about to change. Before it was called Haiti, the western third of the island of Hispaniola was known as Saint-Domingue, a French colony roughly the size of Maryland. By the middle of the 18th century, it had become the single most profitable piece of colonial real estate on the planet. Not the most profitable in the Caribbean, on the planet. Saint-Domingue produced approximately 40% of all the sugar consumed in Europe, 60% of its coffee. It exported cotton, indigo, and cacao in volumes that made the treasuries of competing empires twitch with envy. By the 1780s, nearly 2/3 of France's total foreign trade ran through this one island. The wealth that flowed from its ports into Bordeaux and Nantes and Paris funded aristocratic lifestyles, built grand estates, and kept the French treasury from collapsing under its own weight. Every franc of it was produced by enslaved human beings. By 1790, there were roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue. They made up about 90% of the colony's population. The white planter class, the Grands Blancs, numbered around 40,000. Between them sat a complicated middle tier of free people of colour, many of whom were themselves property owners and even slaveholders, but who were denied the political rights of whites despite their wealth. The colony was a pressure cooker of competing interests and barely suppressed violence, and the people at the bottom of it were being worked to death on a schedule. The conditions endured by the enslaved in Saint-Domingue were not merely harsh. They were among the most savage in the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade. The sugar plantations operated on a system designed to extract the maximum amount of labour from a human body in the shortest possible time, with the full expectation that the body would be destroyed in the process. The average life expectancy of an enslaved worker on a Saint-Domingue sugar plantation after arriving from Africa was less than 10 years. The plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to import new enslaved workers than to provide conditions under which existing workers might survive and reproduce. That calculation was made explicitly in writing, in colonial administrative documents. It was not a secret. It was policy, and for decades it held. Then, on August 22nd, 1791, it ended. A ceremony at a place called Bois Cayman, a gathering of enslaved people the night before, and then simultaneously across the northern province, plantations began to burn. The signal had been planned. The organisation had been building in secret for months. Within days, the northern plain of Saint-Domingue was in revolt, and the fire that started there would not be put out for 13 years. The Haitian Revolution is the only successful slave revolt in history to result in the founding of a new nation. This needs to be stated clearly, because the word revolution can obscure what actually happened. This was not a political realignment or a change in government. This was 500,000 people who had been classified as property deciding, collectively and at enormous personal cost, that they were not property, and fighting a 13-year war to prove it against the most powerful colonial empire of the era. The leaders who emerged from that chaos were extraordinary. Toussaint Louverture, a former enslaved man who had been allowed to learn to read, became the revolution's most brilliant military commander. He played French, Spanish, and British forces against each other with a tactical sophistication that made European generals uncomfortable. He abolished slavery throughout Saint-Domingue and declared himself governor for life under nominal French sovereignty. He was not interested in independence yet. He was interested in freedom and in building a state capable of defending it. Napoleon Bonaparte had other ideas. In 1801, Napoleon sent an expedition of approximately 40,000 soldiers to Saint-Domingue under the command of General Charles Leclerc, who happened to be Napoleon's brother-in-law. The stated mission was to restore French authority. The actual mission, which historians have since confirmed from French archives, was to re-establish slavery. Napoleon had decided that the colony was too valuable to leave in the hands of its own population. Leclerc lured Toussaint Louverture into negotiations under a flag of truce, and then arrested him. Toussaint was shipped to a prison in the French Alps called Fort de Joux, where he died in April 1803. The tactic backfired. The revolution did not collapse without Toussaint. It accelerated. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a man who had been enslaved and bore the scars of it on his back, took command and made clear that the negotiating phase of the revolution was over. And then yellow fever arrived. The French soldiers, mostly from Europe with no immunity to tropical disease, died in staggering numbers. Leclerc himself died of yellow fever in November 1802. By the time the campaign was over, Napoleon had lost somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers to battle and disease in Saint-Domingue. It was one of the worst military disasters in French history, and it happened before Waterloo, before Russia, before any of the campaigns that Napoleon is remembered for losing. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines declared independence and renamed the country Haiti, the original Taino name for the island. France had been defeated. The most profitable colony in the world was gone, and Napoleon, staring at the ruins of his American ambitions, made a decision that changed the shape of a continent. He sold Louisiana. This is the connection that does not appear in most American history textbooks. The Louisiana purchase was not primarily a real estate transaction or a diplomatic coup. It was the direct consequence of Haiti's revolution. Napoleon had wanted Louisiana as the agricultural support system for a Caribbean empire centered on Saint-Domingue. With Saint-Domingue gone, Louisiana was strategically useless to him. He needed money for his European wars. Jefferson's offer arrived at exactly the right moment. The same enslaved people whose labour had generated the wealth that made Saint-Domingue the crown jewel of the French Empire had, in the process of freeing themselves, destroyed Napoleon's plans for that empire entirely, and in doing so handed the United States 828,000 square miles of territory that became, in whole or in part, 15 states of the modern American Union. Think about what that means for a moment. Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Louisiana, most of New Mexico, most of Montana. All of it exists as American territory because of what happened in Haiti between 1791 and 1804. If you'd asked anyone in Europe or America in 1804 what they thought about Haiti's independence, they would have told you it was a threat, and they would have been honest. Haiti's existence was deeply uncomfortable for every slaveholding society in the Western Hemisphere. The United States refused to recognize Haitian independence for 58 years until 1862, because recognizing it would mean acknowledging that enslaved people had rights, including the right to fight for their freedom. Southern slaveholders were explicit about this. They did not want Haiti's example to travel. Thomas Jefferson, who had been so pleased to buy Louisiana from Napoleon, spent the rest of his presidency trying to economically strangle Haiti through trade restrictions. The man who wrote that all men are created equal spent considerable political energy ensuring that the men who had proved it at gunpoint remained isolated and impoverished. Britain refused recognition for decades. Spain refused it. The Caribbean colonies of other European powers watched Haiti with something between fear and fury, because what had happened there was, from their perspective, a catastrophe that could spread. And into this isolation, in 1825, France sent warships. 21 years after independence, France arrived in Haitian waters with a fleet of 14 warships carrying 500 cannon. The message they carried was straightforward. France was willing to recognize Haitian independence and normalize trade relations. In exchange, Haiti would pay 150 million gold francs as compensation to the former colonists for their lost property. That property included the plantations, the infrastructure, and the enslaved people themselves. France was demanding that Haiti compensate the people who had enslaved its population for the crime of no longer being enslaved. That's not a metaphor, that is what the invoice said. Haitian President Jean-Pierre Boyer faced a calculation with no good options. Without French recognition, Haiti remained diplomatically isolated, unable to fully participate in international trade, unable to establish the relationships that a new nation needs to survive. The United States had already demonstrated its willingness to use trade as a weapon. Britain was watching. Every other European power with Caribbean interests was watching. Boyer agreed to the terms. Haiti did not have 150 million gold francs. It had nothing close to 150 million gold francs. To make the first payment, Boyer took out loans from French banks at interest rates that would be considered predatory in any era. The debt was restructured and renegotiated multiple times over the following century, and each restructuring came with new terms that benefited the lenders and extended the payment timeline. By 1900, Haiti was spending approximately 80% of its national budget on debt service. Not on roads, not on schools, not on hospitals, on debt payments to France and to the banks that had financed France's original demand. And somehow, it gets worse. In 1915, the United States Marine Corps invaded Haiti. The official justification was political instability, which was real. Haiti had seen considerable political turmoil in the years leading up to the invasion, including a series of coups and counter-coups that reflected the enormous internal pressures of a country spending 4/5 of its budget on foreign debt. But the actual American motivation was financial and strategic. American banks had significant stakes in the Haitian debt structure by this point. American business interests had designs on Haitian land and resources, and the United States, in the middle of the First World War, did not want a strategically located Caribbean island potentially falling under German influence. The occupation lasted 19 years. During that time, American forces controlled Haiti's customs houses, which controlled Haiti's revenue. They rewrote the Haitian constitution, removing a provision that had banned foreign ownership of Haitian land, because American sugar companies wanted access to Haitian land. They suppressed uprisings with considerable violence. A revolt in 1919 and 1920 was put down by US Marines and resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 2,000 and 15,000 Haitians, depending on the source. And during the first days of the occupation, before a formal financial arrangement was established, American officials arranged for the physical transfer of Haiti's gold reserves to New York. Not a transfer of funds. A physical removal of gold from the Haitian National Bank, loaded onto a ship and taken to a bank in Manhattan. The gold was eventually credited to a Haitian account, but the act established, immediately and clearly, who was actually in charge of Haiti's money. The occupation ended in 1934. The debt did not. Haiti made its final payment on the original French indemnity, restructured and refinanced many times over in 1947. This fact rarely appears in history books. The year 1947 is not ancient history. People alive today were born before Haiti finished paying France for the crime of ending slavery. And in 2022, the New York Times published an investigation that attempted to quantify what that debt had cost. The number the investigation arrived at was $21 billion in today's equivalent. $21 billion paid by Haiti to France, and to the banks that financed France's demand, extracted from a country that had been the wealthiest colony in the Western Hemisphere and was systematically impoverished by the payments required to maintain its freedom. The story does not have a clean ending. That is part of what makes it worth telling. Haiti today is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Its infrastructure has been repeatedly damaged by natural disasters, including an earthquake in 2010 that killed over 150,000 people, and a hurricane in 2016 that killed nearly 1,000, and destroyed a significant portion of the country's agricultural output. Political instability continues. In 2021, the Haitian president was assassinated. International interventions have continued in various forms, generally making things worse. The historians and economists who study Haiti's trajectory point to the indemnity as the foundational damage. a country that spent the first 122 years of its existence redirecting the majority of its public revenue toward a foreign debt was not building roads, not building schools, not building hospitals, not building the institutions that a functioning state requires. The debt did not merely take money, it took time. It took a century and a quarter during which the basic business of nation building was deferred, because the money that should have funded it was leaving the country. France has never paid reparations. In 2022, French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged that the indemnity had been a moral wrong, and his government commissioned a report on the historical relationship between France and Haiti. The report, released in 2023, confirmed the historical record and described the indemnity as an illegitimate extraction. It did not recommend financial restitution. France has not offered financial restitution. The United States has never formally acknowledged the role its occupation played in deepening Haiti's structural impoverishment, or the role of American banks in profiting from the debt structure, or the role of its early trade restrictions in isolating a country that had the temerity to prove that enslaved people were people. This story isn't unique in its broad shape. Colonized countries carrying the financial weight of their colonizers is a pattern that repeats across the 19th and 20th centuries, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific. What makes Haiti specific is the particular cruelty of the mechanism. Haiti did not merely carry colonial debt, it carried debt incurred for ending its own enslavement, and it carried it while the entire international system that had benefited from that enslavement watched and said nothing. The country that generated more wealth than any colony in the world, the country that stopped Napoleon, the country that accidentally handed America half a continent, paid for its freedom with 122 years of impoverishment. And the people who built the modern world sugar economy with their bodies, who defeated the most powerful army in Europe with their determination, who changed the map of North America as a side effect of fighting for their own lives, are described in the historical record primarily as a cautionary tale about political instability. The final payment on the Haitian indemnity was made in 1947. France spent the money, the banks kept the interest, and Haiti kept the debt. That is the record, hidden or otherwise. There is a detail about the 1825 indemnity that does not appear in most tellings of this story, and it changes the moral weight of what happened considerably. The 150 million gold francs that France demanded was not a number arrived at through any neutral calculation. It was an estimate of the market value of the property that the French colonists had lost, calculated by France for France's benefit, using France's methodology. The enslaved people themselves were valued as property in that calculation. Their market price, as determined by French colonial records, was included in the total that Haiti was required to pay. This means that the people who had freed themselves from slavery were required to pay, in cash, for the assessed market value of their own bodies. Not metaphorically, literally. The indemnity included a line-item valuation of human beings, and the descendants of those human beings made payments against that line item for over a century. The French banks that handled the transactions were sophisticated financial institutions operating in the mainstream of European finance. The Banque de France was involved. Private banks with branches in London and New York were involved. These were not fringe actors. They were the financial establishment of the 19th century, and they profited systematically from a debt that should never have existed. The interest rates on the loans Haiti took to make its payments range from 6 to 10% in an era when sovereign borrowers with good credit paid much less. Haiti's credit was deliberately structured to be expensive because Haiti had no alternatives. It could not shop for better rates. It could not refuse to pay and expect to survive the consequences. The isolation enforced by non-recognition, the trade restrictions imposed by the United States, the constant presence of French warships in Haitian waters during the early payment years, all of it was a system designed to ensure that Haiti paid, and paid dearly, and had no recourse. The word for this, in the language of international finance, is coercion. The word for it in plain language is extortion. And it operated with the full legitimacy of 19th century international law, which was written by the same European powers that were extracting the payments. All right, so here's where things get particularly dark. The United States occupation of 1915 is often presented, when it is presented at all, as a well-intentioned if heavy-handed intervention to stabilize a chaotic situation. The documents tell a different story. American State Department and military records from the period make clear that the primary concern driving the occupation decision was financial, not humanitarian. American banks held Haitian debt. American sugar companies wanted Haitian land. The National City Bank of New York, which later became Citibank, had acquired significant interests in the Haitian financial system in the years before the occupation, and its executives had direct access to senior American government officials in the Wilson administration. The invasion was, in significant part, a debt collection operation with military force. The new constitution that American forces imposed on Haiti in 1918, drafted in part by Franklin Roosevelt, who was then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, removed the constitutional provision that had banned foreign ownership of Haitian land. This was not a side effect of occupation, it was a primary objective. The ban on foreign land ownership had been included in every Haitian constitution since independence, because Haitian founders understood that a country where foreigners could buy land was a country that could be recolonized through economics rather than armies. American sugar companies wanted the land. American forces removed the legal protection against their acquiring it. The 1919-1920 revolt against the occupation, led by a man named Charlemagne Péralte, was suppressed with methods that American military reports described in clinical terms, and that later historians have described as atrocities. Peralta himself was killed by a Marine who had infiltrated his camp under false pretenses. His body was photographed tied to a door in a pose deliberately evocative of crucifixion, and the photograph was distributed as propaganda to demoralize the resistance. The Marine who killed him received the Medal of Honor. The American press largely supported the occupation. The mainstream American narrative framed it as an effort to bring stability and development to a country that was incapable of governing itself. The racial assumptions embedded in that framing were explicit and were stated as such by American officials at the time. Haiti's instability, in this telling, was a product of Haitian incapacity, not of a century of financial extraction, enforced by international isolation. The documentation of what actually drove Haitian instability, the debt, the percentage of the budget consumed by payments, the systematic exclusion from the international economic system that other nations took for granted, was available at the time. It was simply not the story that major powers and their media found convenient to tell. By the time Haiti made its final debt payment in 1947, the country had been independent for 143 years and had spent 122 of them paying for that independence. The generation that came of age in Haiti in 1947 was the first generation in the country's entire history that did not carry the financial weight of the indemnity as a direct burden on the public budget. That should have been a moment of liberation. It was not, because by 1947, the structural damage was already embedded in every institution, every road that hadn't been built, every school that hadn't opened, every hospital that hadn't been funded, every generation of administrators and engineers and doctors who hadn't been trained because the money that would have trained them had gone to Paris and New York. The debt was paid, the damage was permanent. The New York Times investigation, published in 2022, titled The Ransom, spent over a year tracing the flow of money from Haiti through the French financial system and into the hands of specific families and institutions. The investigation was methodologically careful. It traced individual payments to individual recipients. It found that the descendants of the original colonist families, the families whose lost property the indemnity had compensated, were still prosperous in France, the proceeds of the Haiti payments having funded businesses and estates and educational opportunities across generations. It found that the French banks that had handled the debt had grown into major financial institutions on, in part, the interest they had collected from Haiti. It found that the entire transaction, from the initial demand to the final payment, had transferred wealth from one of the world's poorest countries to some of the world's most comfortable institutions and families over a period of more than a century with the full legal sanction of international law as it existed at the time. France's response to the Times investigation was measured. Government officials acknowledged the historical record. A commission was established. A report was produced. The report described the indemnity as a moral injustice. No financial restitution was offered or seriously discussed. The United States government has not formally engaged with the historical record of its occupation and its role in Haiti's impoverishment at the official level, though individual historians and officials have acknowledged it over the years. The pattern this story represents is not unique to Haiti. It is the operating model of 19th and early 20th century imperialism, applied most brutally to the one country that had the audacity to end slavery by force and survive long enough to declare independence. The punishment for that audacity was designed to be permanent. The financial instruments were the whip by other means. What makes Haiti's story different from other stories of colonial extraction is the specific cruelty of the mechanism. Most colonies were exploited through the extraction of labour and resources. Haiti was exploited through the extraction of the proceeds of its own freedom. The revolution succeeded militarily. It was then reversed slowly and systematically through finance, isolation and occupation over the course of a century and a half. The story of the Louisiana Purchase is taught as a triumph of American statecraft. The story of why it happened, the 500,000 people who made it possible by defeating Napoleon's army and ending his American ambitions, is a footnote at best. The story of what happened to those 500,000 people and their descendants over the following century and a half is not taught at all in most of the countries that benefited from their sacrifice. That is what the record shows. Whether it is hidden or merely inconvenient is a question each viewer gets to answer for themselves. Haiti is still there. The warships are gone. The debt is paid. The damage is not. The revolution itself deserves more space than it typically gets, because the standard telling compresses 13 years of extraordinary complexity into a simple arc of slaves rising up and winning. What actually happened was considerably more interesting and considerably more instructive. The revolution went through multiple phases, with shifting alliances, internal conflicts, and competing visions of what a free Haiti should look like. Toussaint Louverture, the revolution's most famous leader, was himself a man of contradictions that historians have been wrestling with ever since. He had been a privileged enslaved person, allowed to learn to read and given supervisory responsibilities on his plantation. He owned enslaved workers himself for a period before the revolution. When he took power, he banned emigration, imposed strict labour requirements on Haitian workers to keep the plantation economy functioning, and aligned himself at various points with both France and Spain when it suited his strategic purposes. None of this diminishes what he accomplished, but it complicates the simple hero narrative in the way that reality always complicates simple hero narratives. The revolution's defining figure in terms of eventual independence was Dessalines, not Toussaint. Dessalines had no patience for the diplomatic manoeuvring that Toussaint practiced. He had been enslaved and brutalized, and the scars on his back, reportedly from whippings, were visible to everyone who met him. When Napoleon had Toussaint arrested and shipped to France to die in prison, Dessalines concluded that there was nothing to negotiate with France and proceeded accordingly. His military strategy against Leclerc's army was brutal and effective. He used the terrain, used yellow fever as an ally by maintaining pressure on French forces during the disease season, and accepted enormous casualties among his own forces in exchange for attrition of the French. The battle was not clean. Atrocities were committed on both sides. After independence was declared, Dessalines ordered the killing of most of the remaining white French population in Haiti, calculating that allowing them to remain would create an internal threat and an external justification for French military return. This decision has been used for 2 centuries to discredit the revolution, to frame it as evidence of Haitian savagery rather than of the logic of a population that had watched what happened when it left former colonists in place. The historical record is more complex. The killings were horrifying. They were also rational, in the cold, strategic calculus of a leadership that understood what France would do if given the opportunity. Dessalines himself was assassinated in 1806, 2 years after independence, by a coalition of Haitian elites who found his policies too radical. The political instability that followed his death set the pattern for the next century of Haitian governance, and it is worth noting that this instability was not random. It was structural. A country that spent 80% of its budget on debt payments could not build functioning institutions. A country that was diplomatically isolated could not develop normal political relationships with the outside world. A country under constant external pressure, from France's warships to American trade restrictions to eventual military occupation, could not develop the internal political stability that requires a degree of external security. The instability was not a cause of Haiti's poverty, it was a symptom of it. And the poverty was not a natural condition. It was manufactured through the debt, through isolation, and through occupation by the same powers that had benefited from Haiti's wealth when that wealth was generated by enslaved people. There is one more figure in this story who deserves to be named, and who almost never is. His name was Boiron-Tonnerre, and he was the man who wrote Haiti's Declaration of Independence. He was a Haitian intellectual who had been educated in France and who returned to fight in the revolution's final phase. When Dessalines asked him to draft the Independence Declaration, his response was, reportedly, that they needed to use the skin of a white man as parchment, the skull of a white man as an inkwell, and the blood of a white man as ink. It is a quote that has been used to portray the revolution as racial hatred rather than political liberation. What is rarely noted is the context. Boiron-Tonnerre was a man who had watched the country that educated him send an army to re-enslave his people. He was a man who had seen what France did to Toussaint. He was making a rhetorical point about what kind of document this needed to be, about the moral clarity required to declare independence from a country that viewed his people as property. The rhetoric was extreme. The underlying demand that the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue be recognized as human beings with the right to govern themselves was the most basic demand in the history of political philosophy. The declaration was written, the independence was declared, and then the invoice arrived. The pattern that Haiti's story reveals is not primarily a story about France's cruelty or America's cynicism or the specific mechanics of colonial debt, though it is all of those things. It is a story about how systems maintain themselves. The international order that existed in 1825 was built on the premise that certain people had the right to own other people, and that this right, once established, created property interests that law and force would protect. When Haiti ended slavery by force, it did not merely free its own population. It challenged the legal and moral foundations of an entire global economic system. The response of that system, the debt, the isolation, the occupation, was not irrational or even, within its own logic, unjust. It was the system protecting itself. The same system had decided what Haiti was worth when it was a colony. It then decided what Haiti owed for no longer being a colony. And it had the warships and the banks and the diplomatic machinery to enforce both decisions. This is the part of the story that tends to make people uncomfortable regardless of their political orientation, because it does not offer a simple villain whose removal would have fixed things. The 150 million francs demand was made by the French government, but it was supported by French public opinion, by French banks, by French legal scholars who found it entirely proper, and by the silence of every other European power that chose not to object. The American occupation was ordered by Woodrow Wilson, but it was supported by American banks, by American sugar companies, by American newspapers that framed Haitians as incapable of self-governance, and by a Congress that did not object for 19 years. The system, not the individual actors within it, is what produced 122 years of debt payments. And systems are harder to assign blame to and harder to reform than individual villains. Haiti's story does not end in 1947 with the final debt payment, and it does not end with the 2022 New York Times investigation, and it does not end with Emmanuel Macron's acknowledgement that the indemnity was a moral wrong. It is still in progress. The structural damage is still in progress. The political and economic consequences of a century and a quarter of financial extraction are still being lived by Haitian people who did not choose those consequences and who had no more ability to refuse them than the generation of 1825 had to refuse the warships in their harbour. What changed is that the record exists. The documents are public, the calculations are available, the flow of money from Haiti to France and to the banks has been traced in detail by serious historians and journalists who spent years doing the work. The hidden part of this record is no longer hidden. It has simply not been incorporated into the standard telling of the history of the 19th century, or into the standard telling of the Louisiana Purchase, or into the standard telling of what the word revolution means when applied to people who are classified as property. The country that stopped Napoleon is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The country that handed America half a continent has never received acknowledgement from America for doing so. The country that paid 122 years of ransom for ending slavery has never received a centime of it back. The record shows all of this. Whether it changes anything is a different question, and one that is still, as of today, unanswered. There is one final element of this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it sits at the intersection of economics, history, and the specific way that poverty compounds itself across generations. When economists talk about the long-term consequences of the Haitian indemnity, they use a concept called counterfactual development, which is a way of asking what would have happened if the debt had not existed. What would Haiti have looked like if the 80% of its national budget that went to debt payments had instead gone to public investment? The numbers are not precise, because history does not run controlled experiments, but the orders of magnitude are instructive. The $21 billion that Haiti paid in today's equivalent, extracted over 122 years from a country with a small and impoverished economy, represents an amount that, if invested in infrastructure and education and healthcare over that same period, would have produced a fundamentally different country. The roads that were not built did not just fail to move goods. They failed to connect markets, which suppressed agricultural productivity, which kept rural incomes low, which kept people in subsistence farming, which meant there was no surplus to tax, which meant there was no revenue to build the next road. Poverty compounds. The absence of investment compounds. Each year of debt payment was not merely a year of lost public spending, it was a year of lost compound development. This is why the historians who study Haiti most carefully reject the framing of Haitian poverty as a product of political dysfunction, or natural disaster, or cultural factors. Those things are real and they matter, but they are downstream of the foundational structural damage, which is the indemnity and everything that flowed from it. You cannot understand Haiti's politics without understanding that its political institutions were built in the context of a country spending most of its revenue on foreign debt. You cannot understand its economic development without understanding that the capital that should have funded it was leaving the country for over a century. You cannot understand its relationship with international institutions, with the IMF, with the World Bank, with foreign NGOs, without understanding that the pattern of foreign financial control over Haitian public resources has been in place in various forms since 1825. The 2010 earthquake killed over 150,000 people and made over 1.5 million homeless. The death toll was catastrophic partly because of the quality of construction in Port-au-Prince, and the quality of construction reflected decades of inadequate public infrastructure investment, and the inadequate public infrastructure investment reflected a government that had historically had insufficient revenue to invest, and the insufficient revenue reflected the debt payments and the occupation and the financial structures that had extracted capital from Haiti across generations. The earthquake was a natural disaster. The death toll was a product of history. This is not to say that every problem Haiti faces is reducible to the indemnity. It is to say that you cannot understand the problems Haiti faces without the indemnity. It is the load-bearing fact in the story, the one that, if you remove it, makes the rest of the history incoherent. The country that won its freedom and was billed for it for 122 years is still paying, in ways that the invoice did not enumerate and that no restructuring agreement has addressed. The payment stopped in 1947, the accounting did not. That is the hidden record.